Last week I attended a press event in London where I got to try out some of the new games to be released by Bethesda, and that included Fallout 4 and Skyrim in virtual reality. And in this video I'm going to give you some idea of how it felt to play those games on the Vive and the PlayStation 4. Please note that none of the footage you're going to see in this video is from virtual reality. They didn't let us record anything, and to be honest, you probably wouldn't want to see it anyway. When you record VR footage, it's always fairly unpleasant to watch. It's great to experience it, but watching it is like watching a man with a camera strapped to the side of his head jump around. It's not the best experience. And you should also understand that these games are currently planned to be exclusives for certain systems. Skyrim is going to be exclusive for the PlayStation 4 and Fallout 4 for the Vive. I'm going to assume those are timed exclusives and they will make it to other systems. For example, I would like to see Skyrim VR on the PC, and I'm sure PlayStation 4 players would like to see Fallout 4 on their console. This of course does mean I don't have any first-hand experience with, say, Skyrim on the Vive. However, I think I can make some educated guesses. However, I'm going to start by discussing my experience with Skyrim on the PlayStation 4. And the reason I've come to Bleakfall Barrows at the moment is because that's where this virtual reality demo was set. And I can tell you it is pretty cool to visit this place in VR. However, the first thing I noticed straight away was the PlayStation 4 virtual reality did not feel as good as, say, Oculus virtual reality. That's probably to be expected and may come down as a bit of a duh to most people, but it's worth mentioning. And I don't just mean it isn't as good resolution or frame rate. I mean, there is less of a feeling of depth perception. So when I was looking at these ruins, it wasn't as obvious, it didn't feel as obvious that certain objects were further away than others, whereas whenever I've tried VR in the past on the Oculus, and indeed on the Vive, you really got a massive sense of objects that were close and far away. You still got that sense in the PlayStation 4 VR. If you looked at an object that was close and then looked at one that was further away, you did get the feeling of depth, you got the feeling of size, but it didn't have the same majesty that I got in other games on the Oculus. And I think that might have something to do with the field of view, which seems to be a little wider than it should be. I felt like objects were further away than they should be. People, for example, whenever I was at combat distance, they would be hitting me from what seemed to be way over there, as if they were stood right next to me. And it was very noticeable that angles on walls and buildings were a little off. So things that I knew were 90-degree angles did not look 90 degrees, and that gave the entire thing a slightly unreal feeling. Now, I can tell you I got no such impression from Fallout 4 on the Vive, which is the same engine. Everything felt right, all the dimensions felt correct, the proportions, and I got a massive sense of depth, so I felt like I was there far more. That could just come down to resolution as well. All I can tell you is I was somewhat disappointed in the VR experience when outside. It didn't feel as vast as I was hoping it was going to be. I suspect when it makes its way to Vive, if it makes its way to Vive, that will not be a problem. And I'm hoping it makes its way to Oculus as well, but we'll just have to see. And that when I walk around Bleakfall Barrows, I will feel the size around me and the distance of the mountains, because of course that is why we are trying to experience these games in VR. I can tell you that the movement was not a problem. It did not cause me any nausea or dizziness whatsoever, which was a pleasant surprise. But that seems to be because they have gone for a teleport-based movement system. You cannot teleport very far. You sort of point at the ground in front of you and you basically zip there. It's relatively easy to do and you do get used to it. Obviously, it's not quite as immersive as just walking around like this. I can tell you that in Fallout 4, they allow you to move around as I'm moving now, and I didn't get any nausea doing that either. So I'm hoping when this comes, if this comes to the Vive, if Skyrim comes, you'll be able to do the same movement, and it really was not a problem. On the PlayStation 4, though, you have to stay facing the same direction. So, you know, if you're stood facing your TV, when you turn, you press a button to turn, and it kind of turns you, I think it's 45 degrees, and then again 90, and so on. So you keep pressing it to turn, and that's because you cannot turn. There's only one sensor. On the Fallout 4 on the Vive, you pretty much turned by turning. You just stood on the spot and looked in the direction you wanted to go, and again, you had full movement control. So it was a much better experience, in my opinion, on the Vive. Again, not really a big surprise, I guess. One very important thing to note about the PlayStation 4's style of movement is the difficulty you're going to have on things like tight staircases. Because with a mouse or a controller you just constantly move sideways and strafe and turn, you'll get used to going down these pretty easily. With the controller, what was happening was I'd teleport straight ahead and then have to go turn, 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 then move straight ahead and so on. And it could take a while to climb stairs like that. This is probably not going to be a problem on the Vive once again, because you will be able to turn normally. You'll just be able to stand there and turn in the direction you want to go. But on the PlayStation 4, that is going to be a bit of a problem. Combat was a little interesting. The melee combat felt a little off, in my opinion. I mean, in Skyrim, when you hit, you feel like you're putting some effort into the blow. Whereas in VR, you kind of feel like you're waving at them with a feather duster. There's no weight in the hand controller whatsoever, and the game doesn't seem to require you do, you know, giant swings. You can almost sort of just jiggle the sword at them a little bit and they die. So, you know, you just walk up to them and like jiggle, 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 and they die. And it feels a little unrewarding. That might be a problem with any and all VR games of this nature. I mean, how on earth you do melee combat well, I do not know. Bow combat was even worse. In theory, you could see how it would work. You hold one controller out ahead of you and you draw the string back with the other controller and you release the arrow, and that is what you were trying to do. But what I found was it felt like the bow was floating off. Instead of being in my hands, I felt like it was floating off a couple of feet to my right at times, and the arrow was difficult to look down. Like here you've pretty much got the arrow at the center of your screen. Not quite, but you get the idea. In VR, it really was hard to keep the bow under control. Now, that may be something that's better on the Vive because it has way better controller detection. Yeah, I never found any problems with any of the VR games I've had on Oculus, nor on the ones I tried with the Vive, detecting where your hands were. This seemed to be a little more of a problem, but only with the bow, because I didn't have a similar problem with spells. I mean, it wasn't as exact with spells when I was aiming, but it was better than the bow. The bow was really hard and unpleasant to use. Hopefully they will figure fix it, or it'll just be better on the PC. My apologies to PlayStation 4 users if I sound like I'm giving up on your experience, but you know, I am a PC gamer, so I'm being a little selfish, I realise. I'm a terrible person, I do apologise. Now, the big surprise for me was the spell combat. Not because I didn't think it would be better, because I did. I assumed spell combat would lend itself more to virtual reality controllers, but because it opened up something I had never thought about before, and that is dual wielding spells. In the base game of Skyrim, when you have two spells, they basically both go the same way. In virtual reality, you are not restricted that way. And indeed, in combat, I found myself actually blasting one direction with fire and another direction with electricity or cold, fighting two things at once, and it was really cool. It worked so well because, of course, you don't need to keep looking at someone. You could sort of recognize there was someone there, start hitting them with one spell, and quickly glance over there to check where they were without moving your arm. Your arm would still be pointing back at the original target, and you had far more situational awareness, so you could do it. And it was so much fun. My apologies to any arachnophobes. You might want to close your eyes for a few minutes, although even the words I'm going to say may creep you out. One thing you should be aware of when fighting in VR is how intimidating the creatures look. This giant spider may look creepy on your screen right now, but when you're in virtual reality and you're stood there looking at it, it's horrific. It's amazing, it's an incredible experience, but it is really intimidating. You do get a feeling that it's there, and even once you've killed it, running around its body and inspecting it is fascinating. It's so much more intense. So just be warned, if you're going to play a game like this, you are going to be a little more nervous, a little more intimidated, and if you do have phobias against certain creatures, well, virtual reality in games like this, definitely not going to be for you. Moving on to Fallout 4 on the Vive, as I said, the experience was a lot more realistic. The demo was actually at the Red Rocket, and it just felt like you were there. I mean, it's the easiest thing to say, but that's pretty damned cool. It's not as visually impressive as, say, Bleak Fall Barrows, which is why I would love to see something like that on the Vive. Because, you know, the Red Rocket is a very cool place, but it is just a small building. It's not a huge big Nordic ruins. However, it was so easy to use. You moved around pretty much as I'm moving now. You could, you know, full range of movement. You just turned naturally and everything felt instinctive. There was no nausea noticeable, at least not for the short period I played, whereas when I tried this sort of a game on my Oculus seated, I did have nausea issues. A lot of it probably comes down to playing standing, which in of itself comes with a host of issues. For example, how do you crouch? I mean, you crouch by squatting. Try doing that for an hour and a half if you're doing a stealth run. And of course, that begs the question, how are they going to do stealth? Because in actual fact, try walking like this for any amount of time. It's tiring, it's bad for your knees, and it's not actually stealthy. If you're being stealthy, you actually bend your knees, you flex them, but you only drop a couple of inches. You might duck your head a little. You try and keep your profile a little lower, but if you're doing this, chances are you're not stealthy at all. You're probably making far more noise. So they're going to have to come up with some new way of doing stealth, in my opinion. Or stealth just is not going to be an option. I mean, I'm getting on a bit, and keeping in that position for longer than about 2 minutes is somewhat tiring, shall we say, and definitely gives my old knees a little jip. So, you know, but generally moving around was a lot of fun. It was very cool. Manipulating objects was, as you would imagine, you use the controllers And, you know, I tried doing a few things like interacting with objects, but that had not been fully implemented, so I couldn't check containers. Not sure how that is going to work. I can tell you, I did try the settlement menu. It was there, but it doesn't actually do anything at the moment, which is a shame, because I actually think settlement building in VR could be the one thing that is just totally and utterly worth it. You know, I mean, there are arguments, you know, for and against VR in a lot of gameplay, but for settlement building, I can't think of any arguments against it. You get to build the settlement and experience living there. So I'm really looking forward to that. The gunplay was really nice. Again, you hold the weapon in using the controllers, but unlike the bow in Skyrim, the weapons were exactly where I wanted them to be. They were very easy to aim with and use. We did a bit of combat against ghouls and raiders, and it really worked well. And it's massively intimidating again. When a ghoul runs at you and they get right in your face and try and bite you and claw you, you find yourself stepping back. It's really unnerving, but it's so easy to fight. I say so easy, I mean, it's just so natural. The ghoul was coming right at me and I just got my double barrel in his face and pulled the triggers, and there was no thought involved. There was no need to wonder about the interface. It's all completely instinctive and was a lot of fun. The way the VR experience handles that is a little different to the normal game, and that should be expected. Of course, you can't really have the VR game take you out of your character and see your character take shots. So, although you can slow down time just like this, you don't see all of these labels with chances to hit. What happens instead is if you aim your gun at a body part, it highlights much as it does now. That means it looks more like this without any of the extras. So you can see exactly where your weapon is pointing, but you don't queue up an action. You pull the trigger and you shoot, and you're almost certainly going to hit that limb. You can execute criticals the way you do in the normal game, and, you know, it's just basically bullet time. It is bullet time for Fallout 4. There is one slight difference. You can still move whilst in this slowdown time, whilst in VATS, and indeed you now get the option to do teleport movement. So I could point over to the left in front of this guy or behind him and instantaneously teleport him for some action points and then start shooting him or hitting him in the back. You can actually use VATS very tactically now. You can sort of shoot at a guy here in the head, and suddenly if you feel like someone over here is shooting a rocket at you, you can move to between them or something and start shooting from a different angle. I'm not sure how the perks are going to work exactly in VR, but seeing as you still get critical hits and action points, I think it'll probably be pretty similar. One part of the demo was in power armor. They had a suit of power armor out on the road, which I could climb into, and yes, you get the sort of helmet feeling. And you do get a slight sense of claustrophobia, but not much actually, a lot less than I thought. And then I ran down to Concord and fought raiders and, of course, the Deathclaw with a minigun. And that was a lot of fun. The minigun's a little strange because you can hold it with one hand. In fact, that's what you do. I think I would like to see the minigun require two hands so that if you move the second hand and looked at your Pip-Boy, that you wouldn't be able to aim the minigun because it felt a bit weird. I was one-handing the minigun, but you know, I stood here with my minigun and I was just mowing down raiders and I was shooting the cars and they were blown up and I was just laughing like a maniac. It felt great. Even fighting the Deathclaw felt brilliant. Kind of intimidating to be that close to a Deathclaw, but we had God mode on, so, you know, it wasn't too bad. Overall, I really can see how it would be a lot of fun to play Fallout 4. Maybe not as a stealth character, but as a shoot everything character, definitely. I don't know how the conversations would work, so that's something to be experienced, but I can't imagine it would be that difficult. It really was a very cool experience, and there was no real problem with it being VR. There was, like with Skyrim on the PlayStation 4, the fact that the movement was only teleport was a problem. The fact that, you couldn't turn did seem to be a problem, and it took you out of the immersion. Teleporting everywhere, it does break it quite a lot. It's strange. In some ways, immersion is like frame rate. You always think more is best, but in actual fact, stable is better. You do want to be immersed in the world, but the more immersed you are in the world because of VR, the more things like teleporting movement feel strange when you do it. But for Fallout 4, you had normal movement as a possibility. Hopefully they'll do the same with Skyrim VR for the Vive, in which case I could definitely see VR, Fallout 4 and Skyrim both being a viable playstyle. The question is, do I think that's the way I would prefer to play, or at least on a first playthrough? And I don't think so. I honestly don't think so. There are still some issues. It's still got a little, it's got a few rough edges, and I think they've still got a long way to go before the experience is as rounded as the normal base game is, especially Skyrim. I have to say, with things like the melee weapon and the bow feeling really kind of clumsy and off, I really would be recommending anyone who's never played Skyrim to play the normal game first. This, of course, means I wouldn't be recommending you rush out and buy VR headset and Skyrim VR game if you haven't already played Skyrim. However, if you've got a VR solution already, if you've got the Vive or you've got the PlayStation 4 headset and you've played Skyrim or you've played Fallout 4 and you really want to just wander around some of the places, especially in Skyrim. I mean, imagine going to the Throat of the World or Riften. I really want to go to Riften and look over the railing at the water below. Imagine doing that in VR. And let's face it, that means game tourism. You're going to be visiting places just to experience them. And if you've got a VR headset, you've probably got a little extra cash, and so maybe that's something you want to do. But right now, for these games, for Fallout 4 and Skyrim, I would say it's not a gimmick, but it's more an experience than a game. It is a game, it's just a little rough at the moment. So I'd say if you've got spare money, buy it, experience it, have a laugh. But if money's tight or you've never played these games before, definitely play the normal version first. One thing I should mention was there was a few minutes towards the end where I did get some nausea, but it was not because of the movement in game. What was happening was I was stood inside the red rocket and I was looking around, and as I looked around, the world started shaking slightly. It was like it was stuttering and shaking as if we were in a very small earthquake. And within a couple of minutes, I felt really quite sick. It was pretty horrible, actually. But it turns out it was the Vive sensors. One of them was switching on and off. It seemed to be malfunctioning, and every time I turned, it was having difficulty figuring out where I was, and thus the entire world was shaking. They told me that this was not a problem with the game, and I tend to believe them. I did see the sensor glitching out, and they said in a previous demo a little earlier in the day, someone had actually hit that sensor with the controller, which I can believe, actually. I can actually believe. You have to spend some time setting your room up so that you don't smash things in your room, smash your hands into walls or the sensors. But if that sort of thing happens, it can cause some fairly serious nausea. I was out for about half an hour after that. I needed to go off, get some food, drink a coffee, and let my stomach settle, because it was really quite disgusting. But as I said, pretty sure that was not the game, that was actually the hardware. So does that mean I feel all games on VR are going to be a gimmick and that when it comes down to it, it's never going to take off? No. Because there was one game I tried there in VR that they had to drag me off. I was having an amazing time. However, I'm going to leave that for another video.